Hello. Today I'd like to address my digital field observations and my in-person field observations that I used for my UDL assignments for this class. Primarily there was only one class that stuck out to me, and that was my in-person observations in Clovis High School at Miss Wolf's classroom for seniors that were taking Gov and History. In Miss Wolf's classroom, I got to experience a lot during my observations. However, I like to particularly focus on the first week when she was absent and had two different subs who taught differently with the instructions that Miss Wolf left behind for them. The first sub was an older gentleman who was particularly active with the students. He patrolled around the classroom, aiding the students whenever they had questions and observing them attentively, and the class remained quiet and on task. However, for the second class of the first week that I observed with the second substitute, I noticed that he was a younger gentleman who was new to the experience of substituting. And from what I noticed is that he didn't interact with many of the students. He remained on his computer at the desk, while the students pretty much neglected their work and essentially talked to one another or slept during the class. What I took note of during this first week was that the teacher is essential and the foundation of the classroom, where they set the mood and the pace for students, such as the first elderly gentleman who was very attentive to the students and took note to what students needed help with, compared to the second who neglected many of the students that may have needed help. In Miss Wolf's class, I was also able to determine what sort of content standards and substandards she was using in her class content, such as 12.4.6, which had explained the process of selection and confirmation of Supreme Court justices, which she was able to do so in her lectures, and many of the assignments that she had earlier in my observations consisted of this sort of content. Additionally, she also discussed the selection and confirmation of Supreme Court justices and the process behind the politics in choosing and selecting these judges, and what kind of trial processes that were used to discuss how justices operate, showing their responsibilities, which was a core part of this lesson plan that she was using at the time for this content standard. What I've noticed between my in-person observations with Miss Wolf's class and some of the online videos with the lower grades is how different the teaching styles are. For example, in the lower levels, the teachers are more attentive and constantly teaching and lecturing towards the students and grasping content with them by connecting it to outside ideas or sources, while also talking to the students to ensure their understanding. In Miss Wolf's class, however, it was quite different, where she followed a lesson plan that was rather straightforward rather than the lower grade levels that I observed, where it kind of seemed all over the place in terms of content, whereas Miss Wolf's was more in a linear direction, and if students did ask questions, she would answer them in a short and concise method, unlike many of the lower grade levels that took an alternate approach. Lastly, in Miss Wolf's class that I particularly took note of was how she used the levels of bloom from taxonomy, such as having her students learn to remember to understand the content that was presented in her lecture, and then to analyze that content and display it into a project that would be applied later in the next week, which I found really interesting. Lastly, to finish off with my observations from Miss Wolf's classroom was how she compared course content to present-day ideas, unlike many of the online observations that I observed. She would connect many of the politicians that they discussed in the class and how they got into office and what kind of policies they implemented and the impact on current-day American society. Additionally, she also described how many of these presidents, such as Donald Trump and Barack Obama, put Supreme Court justices into power based off of their own political opinion rather than background, such as Obama picking a Democrat with similar opinions and views, whereas Trump did the same thing but with Republicans. I found this interesting because teaching content such as government and history should be connected to real-world events so that students are able to grasp and understand the content that they are being taught and how it affected the lives of the people during that era or time period and how it affects the time that they live in now. Overall, I found the observations of in-person and online classes to be very interesting and educational because it has allowed me to learn many of the teaching methods that these teachers use to educate their students. And I hope to implement some of these in the future when I become an educator